This is Donna Anderson for the NDSU Extension Service for the Kids Baking School. And we are going to make a homemade pie crust for the chicken pot pie recipe. You can also, and we will be making the other pie with a store-bought crust. But they're pretty simple to make, and if you can make a homemade pie crust, it does save you money. And you also have the satisfaction of doing something or knowing how to do something yourself from scratch. Okay, so we start off, we're going to make the powdered or the dry ingredient part of our dough first. So let's start off with 3 cups of flour. And if you remember, with dry ingredients, with flour, we always scoop in. We take a spoon and we fill it from the top. We don't scoop it in because that will compact the flour. So there's 1. And 2. And 3. Okay, and we're going to set that to the side. Okay, to this we're going to add a teaspoon of regular salt. And then we're going to quickly whisk up those dry ingredients together so that we don't have a big chunk of salt that someone might bite into. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do, now the recipe says that you could either use lard or you can use vegetable oil like a Crisco. However, I will say that lard will give you a flakier textured pie crust. To me, it also has a better flavor to it. I just like the texture of it. So we need, and there are 2 cups of lard in a box like this. We need 1 1/4 cup of lard. I think this is probably the messiest one I've ever unwrapped. Okay. So I'm just going to divide this in half. And to help it, we're just going to put it into some smaller pieces to begin with. It's going to make it easier for us to blend in with our pastry cutter. And it says that we need 1 additional 1/4 cup. So we're just going to divide that other cup into 4s. Now, if you're using the shortening, I want to keep my cup out here, you will measure your shortening in a dry measuring cup. You scoop it in and you pack it down and then you level it off. So I wanted to keep that there for that. Okay, so if you've never used a pastry cutter before, it actually helps to cut up the little bits of shortening. It coats them in, helps coat into flour, and we want to coat all these little bits. We want to cut them into fine little bits of fat and coat them into flour. So we just press down, and I like to have my fork handy and just coat the bits of fat with flour as I'm working. So you'll see me do that several times. And then I can use the curve of the bowl to help me get all those little portions. And we want to get that down to kind of like a pea size or smaller grains of fat that's in that. And of course, fat is not going to be pie crust. You know, if eating a lot of pie crust is probably not extremely healthy for you. But again, we don't get a lot of the pie crust in our serving. So it's one of these things that it's okay to have once in a while. We talked about those healthy food choices in lesson 2 of our series. And you can see here, we don't have even amounts. We still have some pretty big chunks. We need to continue working. I just want to check and see what kind of chunks I still have in there. And we still have some pretty large chunk yet, so we'll just keep cutting. Now, if you don't have a pastry cutter, you can do another method, and I'll show you that as soon as we get this cut up. Okay, it's looking pretty good. I'm just going to clean off my blades. If you do not have a pastry cutter, you can also just use table knives. Place the blade side down and crisscross cut your pastry or your dough. And then just rotate it. Rotate the bowl. Okay, we have this part done. Now we need to prepare our liquid. So the first thing that it calls for, it does call for water and it calls for an egg. Always crack your egg into a smaller container first to see if it is a good egg. We're going to put it in our bowl. And then, oh, and look here, I've got a little bit of piece of egg in there, or eggshell. I don't want to eat that. So just use your spoon to fish it out. Okay, and to break the yolk up, I want to get this kind of foamy before I add in the water. Okay, we're going to be adding in ice water or cold water. We want to keep our dough as cold as possible. We're going to add 1/2 cup scant, it says. So did you know that the weather also makes a difference in your pie crust? If you're having a humid day, if it's rainy out, you might end up using more flour. Sometimes that can lead to a different taste in that flour. You might have more problems for it sticking onto the surface that you're rolling out. And you see it's kind of foamy. We've got all of our little bits of egg. There's no big chunks of yellow that are in there. Okay, now cider vinegar. Why would I add cider vinegar to a recipe? It does serve a purpose. The cider vinegar actually helps it to have a more tender crust, and it also helps to prevent the development of gluten. Now, we like gluten development when we're making bread because then we end up with a chewy bread product. Or if like pizza crust, we like a chewy pizza crust. But we do not like chewy muffins, and we don't like chewy pie crust. We want it to be tender so that it just breaks off and it melts in your mouth. Okay, so we're going to pour this in. And then we take our fork, and again, remember when we did our muffins, we use that fork to mix it up. And again, we're not trying to develop the gluten. We're going to be working hard enough with this as we roll it, so we definitely do not want to develop the gluten. This recipe will make 4 roll-out pie crusts. So if you were making a pie that had a bottom and a top crust, it would make 2 pies. And the other nice thing about this is that I'm going to roll out pie crust for 1 pie today for our chicken pot pie, but the other, I can freeze that and I can use that at a later date. And we talked about time savers in the kitchen on lesson 2. And you see on the bottom we still have a little of that crust, or a little of the flaky. The flour's not quite mixed up yet. Okay, now we can get our hands in there. We don't want to leave any of that flour in there. Otherwise, we might end up with some soft spots. We want to utilize all the flour that we had in the recipe. And you notice it is coming together so that it's forming a nice cohesive ball. It just sticks together. Okay, I'm going to divide that into quarters. And each one of these will make one pie crust. Okay, I'm going to clean this up, stick this in the refrigerator for a few minutes, let it cool, and then we're going to come back and roll it. Okay, so we're back. We've refrigerated this for about 15 minutes. It got a little warm when I was working with it, so you want to make sure that you cool it down in between working with it. So we're just going to go ahead and I'm going to flatten the little discs, and we're going to set these aside, and we can actually freeze these. So if we do freeze them, just put it in a quart-sized freezer bag. Let's force out some air so that we don't get freezer burn with that. And we'll be able to utilize that a little bit later. So here's another one. And again, we'll just go ahead. Put that in a disc. Put it in our bag. Force out the air. And we'll freeze these so we can utilize those, or we can use those later. Okay, so since we're going to roll one crust at a time, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to refrigerate the other one. Keep it cool. Now you can either use, and we'll actually show us, you can either use one or the other of these to roll your pie crust out, or you can use your counter too. What's nice about using something like this is it tells you how big your pie crust is. So we like to use those, kind of gives us an idea about how big we should be rolling our pie crust. Now the first thing that we want to do, of course, we want to put some flour on here because we don't want it to stick. Now I have a couple sticky spots here, so I'm just going to add a little flour, and where I see the little crevices, I'm going to pinch that together so it doesn't separate on me as I roll it. Okay, I'm going to put it into a disc, and if I put it between my palms of my hand and I start working it from the side, I'm making sure that it doesn't separate on me. And that's going to save me a lot of frustration as I roll, because if I don't do that, I might get these weird pieces that start rolling out on all sides. And that will happen to some degree, but it happens a lot less if you do it this way. I kind of roll it to the side. You can see I'm moving it around. And I have a little separation there. I'm going to coat it with a little bit with flour because, again, okay, so I have my rolling pin. Wood one works fine too. I have this, which you can also, if you have something like these little plastic scrapers, these also work really well. Or if you have a flat edge that you could do. Okay, so I'm not going to push real hard to begin with. I'm going to gently start moving it one direction to the other. Then I'm going to go side to side. And then I'm going to work northwest to southeast, northeast to southwest, and then north, south, east, west, northwest, southeast. And you can see that it's starting to move on me. That's when I know that I have to take my flour that I've got on the board, reposition my dough, and I'm going to flip it over. And you see I have a little separation, so I'm going to just gently tuck that back in. And I don't want any sticking on my rolling pin as well. So I can take and I can coat that with some flour. Okay, north, south, east, west, northwest, southeast, northeast, southwest, north, south, northwest, southeast, northeast, northwest, or southwest, north, south, northwest, southeast, north, south. And you see I have a little soft spot there. So I had a bigger patch of fat, a little bit of lard. So I'm just going to coat that with some flour by hand. Making pastry is all about touch. So you observe, you see, and then you fix. And you can see that I do have a couple little weird areas, and I'm not going to stress out too much about it where it's kind of coming off of that. And I only want this to be about 1/8 of an inch thick. Okay, so there we have it. We know that our pie can fit in there. So it's not quite round. That's okay too. Okay, so what I'm going to do with this is that and I don't cut into my pastry board or my cutting cloth there with the knife. I'm just cutting through the pastry. I want a nice round surface to work with. So, and I might use some of these others. If I didn't get it quite round, I can use those little bits of pastry to patch in my pastry, my pie crust. Okay. That being said, I'm just going to place that to the side. And then I like to have a little bit of flour on the board that I can dip my scraper in. That helps me to get underneath. And we're going to first place that, we're going to divide it into half, or fold it into half, not divide it into half, fold it into half. Okay, now we're going to fold it into 1/4. Why we do that is it helps us to place that in the pan. Okay, does that look about right to you? You might need to do a little adjusting. And then we're going to press that into place. And there is our bottom. Now we're going to go ahead and we're just going to set that aside. And I'm going to show you how to work with a store-bought pastry crust next.